All right. So Steven just gave you the run-through for the whole meeting. We have a lot of things, very great things coming up. But for now, it's my great honor and a pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker of this year's CCN, which is Professor Nancy Kanwisher. So Nancy is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at MIT. She is widely known and respected for her work studying the architecture of the mind. She has led many major discoveries of the functional organization of the human brain, most notably the identification of cortical regions that are selectively engaged in the perception of faces, places, bodies, and fundamentally human cognitive capacities such as music, language, physical reasoning, and the theory of mind. Nancy has received numerous prestigious awards and honors in recognition of her major contributions to cognitive neuroscience, including the Trolland Award, the Carvalho-Heineken Prize for Cognitive Science, and the Kavli Prize for Neuroscience. But we are tremendously pleased to have Nancy here at CCN, because we in many ways consider Nancy to be something like CCN personified. She started her career as a cognitive psychologist, which I quote from one of her interviews is something like trying to understand a car by driving it around and seeing what happens if it breaks. She then pioneered the use of fMRI as a tool to open up the car to find brain regions that are involved in specific aspects of behavior. And on top of that, she now incorporates computational models to understand the mechanisms and the representations in these regions and to ask why questions about how the brain and the mind work using artificial neural networks. So her work embodies this key idea of CCN that we go from mapping of areas to uncovering mechanisms to underlie complex behaviors. And last but not least, Nancy has had a huge influence on CCN because she has mentored and trained many of the PIs who are really at the forefront of this field. Many of them are actually in this room. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Nancy Kanwisher.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so much, Iris. And for the program committee, it's really a thrill and an honor to be here. This is an amazing conference. I learned so much just already yesterday at one of the satellite meetings. It was just incredible. So totally looking forward to the rest of the conference. So the work I'll talk about today is done with the participation of lots of people shown here, but I want to highlight three in particular. First is my dear friend and colleague, Josh Tenenbaum, who has been thinking about intuitive physics way before most of the rest of us have been doing that. I mean, honestly, when Josh used to come into my office and start gesturing and throwing objects, and for a long time, I just had no idea what planet he was on. So it took me quite a while to realize what he was talking about and to just decide, okay, Josh, this is an empirical question. Let's test it. And at that point, we recruited Jason Fisher, who was then a postdoc in my lab, to do some of the early pioneering work, asking whether we might find brain regions engaged in physical inference. And Jason continues to do some really awesome work in this area. And the most recent work that I'll talk about today is by an amazing research scientist from my lab, Pramod. And so he'll figure prominently in today's talk. So I want to start with a brief moment of celebration to note that our field has made a lot of progress over the last few decades in understanding human visual recognition. And that includes discovering the functional organization of the brain regions that do it, all these bits in the ventral visual pathway, and the function of each of the subregions in there, but also in the development of precise computational models like especially artificial neural networks, which are astonishing, well, astonishing to me at least, in their success at capturing both neural responses in these regions and human behavior. And I just want to note that this is kind of an old person thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. It feels weird, but none of this was even imaginable when I was in grad school. And admittedly, that was a very long time ago. But I mention that by saying it's just interesting that it highlights the fact that open scientific questions can go from feeling completely intractable to substantially solved within a single scientific lifetime. And that's kind of cool. So good for us. But also, what I really want to focus on today is that visual recognition is only a small piece of the problem of vision. And so to see that, consider an example scene like this. When you look at this image, you pretty quickly see a fork and a glass and a table and some OJ and a placemat. But you see much more than that, probably also within the first few hundred milliseconds. You see that the glass is supported by the table, that it contains OJ, that could be picked up, but might spill, staining the placemat. Maybe you didn't quite do all of that in 200 milliseconds, but you did a lot of it pretty fast. And the point is that vision is much more than determining an inventory of the set of objects present in the scene and their spatial locations. It includes determining the physical relationships between objects, the action affordances, that is what you can do in this scene, and the possible future states. So this is the rule, not the exception in vision. If you look at an image like this, I don't even need to ask you a question. You empathize with the cup and its peril, even more so here, maybe. If you see a scene like this, you know instinctively not to press there, but to press there. And you can see that trouble is about to ensue in this situation right here. Okay, so the point is that we make intuitive inferences about the physical world frequently, rapidly, effortlessly, and apparently automatically. And these inferences develop very early. In fact, this field, the early work in this field was really started by the cognitive developmental psychologists, René Baillargeon, Liz Spelke, and others, who showed that even very young infants can do many of these things. And so we need these things for understanding what we're looking for, planning any action, predicting what will happen next. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, very broadly speaking, there are two kind of frameworks for how to think about this computationally. One is the kind of reductive view that it's just pattern recognition. And that could mean essentially that it's like object recognition. It's like the kind of thing that we do quickly in the ventral visual pathway, extracting patterns, categorizing them, the kind of thing that largely feed-forward neural networks are good at. And in this case, the representations would be expected to be quite tied to particular perceptual features. Like, for example, when you saw this, maybe what went on there is you have a little, overhang detector that tells you that something's unstable. Actually, I think that's probably a little bit true, even though it may not be the main story, right? But a very different view, the much richer, structured view, is that we have a generative model of the world in our head that represents abstract physical properties and the relationships between objects, like the mass of objects, whether two objects are in contact with each other, that this generative model can generalize to new scenarios, and that it enables us to run probabilistic forward simulations to predict what will happen next. And it is, as Josh Tenenbaum has put it, like a game engine in the head. That didn't mean much to me at first. I've never played a video game, but I gather these things have machinery that programs the objects and things to happen in some physically plausible way, and you need some code to do it, and that's the game engine. And so Josh's idea is we all have one of those things in our heads. So the question I'll approach today is whether the brain has a physics engine, or whether instead we use mental machinery more like that we use in object recognition to solve these intuitive physical inference tasks. Okay, so let's make some predictions. If we have a physics engine in the head, we can make some predictions. We should find brain regions that might be selectively engaged during physical inference. Those regions should have abstract information about physical phenomena, like the mass of objects. Why mass? Well, because it's one of the most basic physical properties of all objects that governs pretty much every physical interaction through Newton's second law, F equals ma. We should have information about the contact relationships between objects. Why contact? Because an object's fate is intertwined with other objects it's in contact with. So, for example, when a container moves, so does its containee. And so if we want to predict future motions of objects, we need to know their relationships to other objects. We can also predict that this brain region, if it exists, should be able to run simulations to predict what will happen next. And further, we might predict that the information extracted in this brain region would not be the kind of thing that you find in a standard image or video trained artificial neural network. Okay, and finally, yes, there was another. That region, crucially, that region should be causally involved in intuitive physical reasoning, not just engaged when you do it. We need to know that it plays a causal role in those tasks. Okay, so that's the agenda, plus some comments at the end. And I'll just foreshadow saying I don't have bulletproof evidence for all of these things. The first one's a few, and they kind of taper off, and let's go. Okay, so are there brain regions that are selectively engaged during physical inferences? So this is the early work that Jason Fisher did with me and Josh. And what he found, since this was published a while ago, is a set of regions in the parietal and frontal lobe that respond more when you do a physical inference task than a control task. In our case, we took one of Tenenbaum's favorite behavioral tasks of looking at these videos of rotating towers and asking whether, when the tower falls, will there be more blocks on the red side or the green side of the platform? So we pop people in the scanner, they see these videos, and they say red or green side. And then in another block, they see the very same videos, but instead they do a non-physical task. They say whether there are more blue or yellow blocks. Okay, and we balance that for difficulty, more or less. And we found that those regions were all more engaged during the tower falling task than the color task. And then we thought, well, that was nice, but who knows? Let's try something else. So we tried something very different. We made these little animations, kind of like the famous hider and symbol animations, where you see two dots moving around, and they're either moving around and interacting physically, ricocheting against each other and against the borders and other objects, or they're interacting socially, chasing and flirting and evading each other. And this is instantly obvious in a couple-second animation. You can see whether they're physical interactions or social interactions. And when you see the physical interactions, these same regions are much more engaged than when you see the social interactions, even in these very stripped-down animations. Okay, we also showed that the same regions we recycled some old data that we had from the ventral pathway, where we realized that our object videos that we use for identifying ventral pathway regions were all objects interacting physically. So we thought, okay, we don't need to scan more subjects. We can predict that those object interactions, even though people are just passively viewing them, should more strongly engage those same regions. And they do. These are the response over a block in those regions when you look at the objects. The lowest response is when you look at faces. And of course, faces are physical objects too. But when you look at a dynamic face, let's hope you're not really thinking of its physicality. That would be weird. You're thinking about who is that person and what are they experiencing and what are they trying to say to me and so forth. Okay, so all of this led to this hypothesis that these brain regions implement our understanding of the physical world, which is based on a generative model that can run forward simulations like a physics engine. Okay, and obviously that hypothesis goes far beyond these initial data, so there's more to do. One of the first things you might already be wondering is if you look at those patterns, you might say, as I have been saying for years to myself, those regions look a lot like things I've seen before. Most damningly, to me at least, they look a lot like the regions that John Duncan has named the multiple demand system. So named because those regions are engaged in pretty much any kind of cognitive demand. You do a more difficult than an easy version of a task, those regions are engaged. So they're like the quintessence of a domain general system. And so what the hell would it mean if they overlap with the physics system? That would mean the physics system isn't really a physics system or not just. And would also mean the multiple demand system isn't just a multiple demand system. So we finally got around to testing that by just scanning people on our physics tower task and on a classic localizer task for the multiple demand system, which is, there's many ways to do it, but we use a spatial working memory task where you see a running series of grids with two dots and you have to kind of superimpose them on your head and say which of these final arrays matches the superposition. It's damned hard. In a contrast of the difficult versus easy version of that task, you get the multiple demand system. And when we scan subjects on both of these tasks, it's critical to do this within subjects, of course, because of the anatomical variability across subjects and the location of any functionally defined region. We find, here's 3 subjects here, we find that actually they mostly don't overlap. The dice coefficient between these two regions is 0.07, so there's only about 10% of the physics activations overlap with the multiple demand system. That was some relief to me. Of course, showing non-overlap is just a difference in significances, not a significant difference, and so you have to test it more stringently. And so we did that by selecting these non-overlapping regions with some of our data and then looking at the held-out data. And when you do that, you see that the physics activations indeed respond much more to the towers and color task, just a replication, but a nice one. And they respond significantly, but not much more strongly in the difficult versus easy spatial working memory task, and vice versa for the multiple demand system. So all that to say, yeah, they overlap a teeny bit, but not much. Okay, so they're mostly different. A source of some relief to me. Okay, so we've identified regions that seem to be more involved in physical inferences. Importantly, they're anatomically distinct from the ventral visual pathway where we think most of object recognition goes on. The first bit of evidence that this is a different kind of system doesn't tell us that it's running different computations, but it's a first guess that it might be. And it's distinct from the multiple demand system. Okay, and so our general procedure in experiments going forward is to use this tower versus color task to identify those regions in each subject individually, and then run new experiments to ask that system new questions, okay? And it's not that the tower task is the only way to identify it, it's just you want relatability to your other experiments, so once you start using a localizer, you get stuck with it for a long time, and then eventually someday we might decide, okay, that wasn't the right one, and we'll switch it. We're not quite there yet. Okay. So, does this same system contain abstract information about physical phenomena? Well, to answer that, first case, we're going to look at whether it represents mass information. And to do that, we use multiple voxel pattern analysis. I imagine everybody here, almost everybody here knows what it is, but in case you don't, very briefly and simply, we collect the pattern of response across voxels within a region in two conditions. And so, for example, we scan people while they look at videos like this one of a light object landing in a pool of water and a heavy object like that, okay? And so from each of these, we get a pattern of response across voxels within the physics network. This is fake data just to show you getting patterns of response across voxels. And then we do the same thing, but using different scenarios to test the generality. So in this case, we dropped a light object versus a heavy object on a pillow. We get the pattern of response in those two conditions. And the key question is whether similar masses produce similar patterns. So do we see a higher correlation within mass, light to light and heavy to heavy, than we see between masses, light to heavy and heavy to light? Okay, this is basically a generalization of Haxby's method from 100 years ago. We also use support vector machines and everything else, but I like the simple versions, and so we always use both. All the things I'll talk about work with both methods. So Sarah Schwetman ran this experiment to ask whether mass information is represented in these regions, and she found significant decoding of mass in these regions across these different scenarios and other objects. And that was true even when subjects were not asked about the mass of the objects, they were just asked to look at the scenarios or to do an orthogonal color judgment task. Okay, so that's the first thing. What about some of these other properties? So Pramod more recently set out to ask whether we can decode whether two objects are in contact or not from this region. So using similar methods to the one I just described, he scanned people while they looked at little videos depicting an object contact relationship being created, in this case containment, and then also the consequences of containment, contingent motion, and also support relationships being created and their consequence being revealed. And then he also, similar videos in which the objects are not in contact, in fact, this instead occlusion, where you don't get contingent motion. And then he scanned people looking at all of these, and with different objects and scenarios, et cetera, he showed that in the physics network, he can significantly decode whether the two objects are in contact or not. But importantly, you can't decode that in V1. That's good, because if you could, you'd worry about low-level confounds. But also, importantly, you can't decode it in the ventral pathway, whether with a standard localizer for LOC or just grabbing the whole ventral pathway. Okay, so that's cool. and shows abstract information in those regions about object-to-object contact. But a more central, or I don't know, I think of it as a more central prediction of the physics, the game engine hypothesis, is that that region makes predictions of what will happen next. And so I think that's kind of the crux of the matter here. So for example, if you see a video like this, the question is whether your brain, your physics network, has predicted this, right? Do you run the simulation forward, maybe even if not asked? And so we asked exactly that question using the same methods, showing people a bunch of different scenarios in which there's an impending collision or an impending miss, and then scanning people also, the same people, also looking at actual collisions or actual misses. And so then we asked whether you could decode an impending collision versus non-collision from a perceived one, as predicted if you're actually constructing the mental representation of the collision when you see a predictable collision. And we found that, in fact, you can decode that exactly from the physics network, again, suggesting it's predicting the future collision, and you can't decode it from these other regions. Again, this is very abstract collision predictions across scenarios, across directions of motion. You can take all the cases where the collision is happening from right to left and decode from those other cases where it's going left to right, and different objects, et cetera. So all of this is consistent with this generative model of the world hypothesis of what's going on in the physics regions. It represents these abstract properties, not just their perceptual, visual features, generalized to new scenarios, and enables forward simulation like a game engine. Though I should say, we haven't really nailed the simulation thing. We've just shown a prediction, and you could generate various kind of cheaper ways of making some pattern prediction, perhaps. So there's more to be done with a stronger test of simulation that would require, multi-step iterative time points, hard to do with functional MRI. So and also importantly, we see this in the dorsal pathway, not in the ventral pathway, famous for doing pattern classification and being well fit by standard ANN models. So all that is consistent with the generative model idea, but it's worth asking whether these more pattern recognition ML models can also do these kinds of tasks even without an explicit physics engine. So we've just started messing around with this, and by we I mean Pramod and a new member of the lab, Georgina Wu. So she's been looking at a bunch of the standard video-trained artificial neural networks. There's an ever-increasing suite of these things, and so she took a bunch of the classic old video-trained CNNs and some more recent ones. And so if the prior research on these, there's a lot of people asking whether these things can do intuitive physics, and debate is ongoing and strong. But one way of synopsizing it is just that the performance of these models is jagged. That is, it's like sometimes they weirdly succeed on one task, but then not on others, and you don't know why. And that pattern is not very human-like. So we decided to test these models on the same stimuli from our functional MRI task to ask whether they implicitly can extract these same distinctions. So we do basically the same experiment, but on these networks. We show them the same stimuli, and we train on contact versus no contact with one set of stimuli. We test with a different set of stimuli, just like we did in the brain. And these models are really terrible at this. A few of them are a little bit above chance, but not very good. We then tested the predicted collision thing, again, training on predicted collision versus non-collision, and testing on observed collision versus non-collision on different scenarios. And again, they do really badly. So then we thought, well, what about vision language models? I can't even remotely keep up with all this stuff. It's just racing so fast. There's a recent paper by Schulze et al. That looked at some of the intuitive physics benchmarks in vision language models and found kind of sort of they can do it a little bit, but it's not very human-like. And then just for fun, Georgina decided to already test GPT-5, which just landed a few days ago. And so we have not kicked all the tires, but here's what she tried. It's pretty funny. She gave it this video that was one of the videos in our fMRI experiment, and she gave it an incorrect label. She asked it, if this video were to continue, will the sphere make contact with a mug? Okay. Well, so GPT-5 thinks and thinks and thinks some more and says, short answer, no, it won't make contact. And here's its predicted trajectory. And at first we thought that, well, that's really dumb. And I thought, well, who knows? Maybe if the ball's going fast enough, there might be some scenario under which it'd do something like that. So then Georgina asked it, well, what if the ball was moving very slowly? And here it predicts that it will go a little ways and stop in the air. Okay. So we don't know, but we need to do lots more tests on lots more benchmarks. But right now, these things are not doing very well at the kind of tasks that we can decode from the physics network. Okay, critical question, what is the causal role of these regions in intuitive physics? We have totally not nailed that, but I'll just mention briefly some exciting initial work with Stephanie Rossett at the University of East Anglia in the UK. She's been testing a large suite of patients with strokes, with brain damage. And first, as prior findings, there's some hints of this in the literature. There's an old paper that shows lesion locations that look a whole lot like our physics network there. And these are the lesion locations from a large set of patients that were predictive of problems in solving novel tool tasks, right? So there are lots of different ways to know that you would flip an egg with a spatula. I'm sure language models know that. There's all kinds of ways to solve that. But if you give people a tool and an object they've never seen before and ask them, or a set of objects, which of these novel tools will be good for picking up this object, then you need to really reason physically, and people with damage here had trouble with that. So we wanted to take a little farther and test our task here, the physics task and the color task. And so far, Stephanie has tested 7 parietal stroke patients and some other patients with lesions outside the physics network. And it's not quite significant yet, but the parietal patients are doing worse on the physics task and yet almost the same on the color task, which is promising. We need to do much more. Unfortunately, amid the other many more serious forms of dysfunction in the US right now, they've decided that all foreign collaborations won't be funded by NIH. What the hell? So anyway, I don't know how we will go on. I'm trying to find different collaborators, find different ways to fund it, but we're stuck at the moment. We will get there eventually. Okay, so I've put light green check marks because I think there's a little bit of evidence for these things, but it's not bulletproof yet. Same for the causal role of these regions. So does the brain have a physics engine? I would give it a resounding maybe, but there's a lot more to be done. And amid stronger tests of all of these things, there's some other open questions that I think are really worth considering. One is, what is the scope of engagement of the physics network? I mean, what do we mean by physics? It's not like it's predefined as a thing. Although I'll just mention briefly, I didn't have time to put the slide in here, but Jason Fisher and his student Mitko did a beautiful behavioral study that came out, I guess, last year, where they used a classic method in psychology and tested a large number of subjects on a whole suite of intuitive physics tasks and other non-physics tasks. And they found that there were correlations across individuals, across their abilities in all the different physics tasks, even after you partial out generic mental abilities with other generic non-physics tasks, suggesting that cognitively intuitive physics is a thing, cognitively, much as we're trying to ask and partly answer that it's a thing in the brain. Okay, but what is that thing and what is its scope? We don't know. And so far, we've only published, and I've only talked about studies testing these regions on a very narrow range of phenomena, specifically rigid objects in images and videos. But there's much more that one might wonder about. One might want to know, are these regions engaged by non-rigid objects? How about auditory stimuli that depict physical events? How about even language? So I want to mention a little bit of work on this. The work on non-rigid objects was just published very recently by Vivian Paulun, also working with Pramod. Vivian started off with the insight that, well, basically, here are some things, and here is some stuff, and the underlying physics of things and stuff is fundamentally different. And because of that, the way we interact with things is fundamentally different from the way we interact with stuff. And that raises a question of whether things and stuff might be processed by distinct mechanisms. So to test that, Vivian and Pramod scanned subjects while they viewed a bunch of different stimuli that Vivian generated. She's really made what I think are just the most fantastic videos or fantastic stimuli in the whole history of my lab. I love these things. So here's a thing that she made in a simulation engine. Here's a non-rigid thing. Here's some stuff, in this case, granular material. Here's a different kind of stuff. So Vivian made a just wonderful series of videos of all different colors and details and scenarios of these 4 different kinds of materials: rigid and non-rigid things and granular and fluid stuff, and measured the response in the physics network. These are the things, and here is the stuff. So they respond to, physics network responds to all of these more than their scrambled controls. That's these very low bars here, but a bit more to things than stuff. And then she also did a reverse contrast and found another region just outside, just ventral to the standard physics region we had been studying so far with rigid objects, right? The tower localizer is rigid objects. And this region responds more to stuff than things. So I love that because we seem to be seeing a functional dissociation with adjacent, I think, parts of the physics network, one apparently more specialized for things and another for stuff. Okay. So what about auditory events? I don't have any data to show you, but a very smart undergrad in my lab, Thomas Brewitt, is working with Vivian and Pramod, and his early pilot data where he played audio clips of physical events produced exactly no response in the physics regions, and we're like, what? And so I don't believe that yet. I said, those aren't vivid enough, let's get some more. So he's in the middle of that, but he already showed in that same experiment that even when he found no response in the physics region to audio recordings of events, the videos of those same events produced a strong response, and most interestingly to me, the video plus audio was higher than the video alone, suggesting that at least auditory physical information enriches and builds on and increases activation in those regions. And so more to be done on that. Okay, what about language? Can we access the intuitive physics system through language? I think this is a deeply interesting question for all kinds of reasons. And it's relevant not just to understanding what this physics network is doing and what it's all about, but about the broader question. I figure near the end of a talk you can go a little bit off the deep end. So let's ask, what does it mean to understand language in the first place? And so we have like nice maps of functional regions in the brain, and we know from the work of Ed Fedorenko and others that these classic language regions in the left temporal and frontal cortex that have been known for 200 years, Ev has shown that they're extremely specific for language per se. They do not get engaged in the whole suite of other mental functions that you might have thought would be similar to language, like music or arithmetic or holding information in working memory. No response. Or understanding computer code, for God's sake. None of those things activate those regions much at all. And also, importantly, those regions are their response is well predicted by large language models. Okay, that's good. However, large language models fail to understand things in language that humans understand. And there's many different versions of that, and a number of papers that have pointed that out in the case of intuitive physics, where a large language model will fail to get something pretty obvious if you ask it through language, a physics question, a question that humans have no trouble with. So some have raised this as a problem with large language models, as models of the brain. But Anya Ivanova wrote this review paper where she argued that we shouldn't blame large language models for not capturing everything that humans do with language, because humans have not just the language system, they've got the rest of the brain, right? And so the idea here, or my version of that idea, I think it's the same as Anya's, but I'm not sure. So mine is maybe a little more simple-minded, is that human language understanding often entails exporting information from the language system, which is rich and does a lot, just like a large language model, but you export it from there to other brain regions that may be specialized for that particular content, right? And so to enrich your language understanding, you do not just whatever the language models, large language models can do, you also export it to other brain systems that can build their own domain-specific model of that stuff. This is mostly just speculation. There is one case where we know this happens, and that's the right temporoparietal junction, this little blue blob here, where Rebecca Sachs has shown with beautiful experiments, dozens of them, that that region is very specifically engaged when you think about other people's thoughts. And all of her early work used language to tap into that. And so it's pretty clear that language, which starts actually in the left regions, this is actually in the right hemisphere, exports that information. Somehow it gets in over to your right TPJ only when the content is about other people's thoughts. And so that would be a case of this exportation that I'm talking about. And so the question I'm raising here is whether understanding language that refers to physical phenomena also similarly exports that information up to this, this physics system. So we've been messing around with that a little bit, giving people word problems about physical things. This is probably too small. It's just, okay, I'll just read it. The robot vacuum cleaner swept through the house, humming and buzzing. Its green and white lights flashed continually as it moved around the living room, removing dust bunnies. Then it got stuck in the curtain, backed up, and bumped into the side table, which knocked a lamp onto the floor. Very physical, right? And then we asked people, what made the table move? The robot vacuum cleaner, the lamp, or both? Okay, so they have to do like a dopey little physical inference from language. And then we contrasted that with intuitive psychology questions, like walking home from work. So you're just lying in the scanner reading this, right? Walking home from work, a woman turned into a dark alley and saw a group of men loitering on its corner, laughing drunkenly. When she heard footsteps behind her, she accelerated her pace and clutched her purse tightly. From that time on, she took the long way home. The woman took the long way home because the alley made her uncomfortable. She liked walking, or both. Okay, another really simple, everyday kind of inference that, refers to physical, phenomena. People are physical things, but it's really referring to their mental states, to their psychological events. Okay, so we have people solve problems like this in the scanner, and we look at the response in those parietal physics regions. In the left hemisphere, language doesn't seem to get as well into the right hemisphere, at least in this case, but we indeed find a stronger response when people are doing this kind of task than that kind of task. And that's an initial bit of evidence. But actually, the backstory on this experiment is that my wonderful colleague Laura Schultz, who's been studying causal reasoning for many, many years, wanted to work with me on studies of causal reasoning. And I said, Laura, there's no way causal reasoning has selective regions in the brain. And she says, I think it might. And I said, I don't think it will. And so I said, well, look, if we can do an orthogonal test where we have physical and social things, then I can test my hypothesis about the physics stuff. But luckily, Laura insisted. And so we have this condition here, which has kind of causal, physical or social causal stuff. But we also have non-causal scenarios, which are just descriptions of physical phenomena where you're asked a question, or descriptions of social phenomena where you're asked a question. And those cases produce much lower responses in those regions, suggesting that the physics regions respond to physical phenomena in a scenario described in language, but particularly one that has causal phenomena in it. So that's pretty cool. And so then we decided to simplify the task and try it another way. And Laura is primarily a developmental psychologist, and so she said there are these great kids games, and we should adapt them because kids games tap into basic things that kids can do, and that's what we want to look for in the brain. So we adapted a kid task where you're given these ice cream cones and scoops, and you're supposed to match the scoop with the cone, and the kid game version is a little bit different. But we just had people match which cause goes with which effect. So you get a little bar saying you have to say, this is the effect, the boat sank, which of these things is the cause? And the cause would be that it had a hole in it. Why did the basketball pop? Because the car ran over it, et cetera. So you do these simple causal reasoning tasks on physical phenomena. And then, of course, we did a social version of it as well, where you had to match physical causes and, social causes and their effects. And then we did a non-causal descriptive version where you just match descriptions, like a red and white candy, it's eaten at Christmas time. And the social one, she uses evidence to present a case, gets matched to, she defends her clients in court. So very stripped down, basic matching task. And again, we find that the left parietal physics regions respond more during the physical language tasks than the social ones, but they also respond more in the causal than descriptive case. And so all of that is consistent with the idea that you can export information from your language system. I assume it has to get in through the language system since you're reading, up to your physics network to solve these problems. But what this does not yet answer is whether and to what extent those same regions are engaged just in kind of normal everyday language understanding. Like here we gave people a task to solve. And what I'm really interested in looking at going forward is to what extent, say, if you're reading a novel and a physical event unfolds and it's vivid, does it activate those regions, et cetera. Okay, summary of findings so far. A systematic set of parietal and frontal regions is recruited by diverse physical inferences. These regions, but not the ventral visual pathway, contain abstract information about object mass, physical stability. I didn't mention that, but that was another study. Whether objects are in contact and future predictions. Preliminary evidence suggests that standard pattern recognition artificial neural networks don't extract this information. Preliminary evidence suggests a causal role of at least the parietal regions in physical reasoning. We see a double dissociation in those regions between processing of physical things versus physical stuff. And we see at least preliminary evidence that those same regions can be engaged through language, especially through causal language describing causal physical events. And all of that is consistent with the hypothesis that these regions implement our understanding of the physical world based on a generative model that can run forward simulations like a physics engine. However, there are loads of unanswered questions that I will end with, just a few here. What else is represented and computed in these regions? We did show that it doesn't overlap much with a multiple demand system, but there's lots of other interesting things that people have shown activate nearby regions. I have for years been wondering about visually guided action, which famously activates those parietal regions up here. And Jody Cullum, who studied those regions for years, I have an email thread where every 2-3 years I email Jody and I say, really, can't we run your grasping task without the whole fancy apparatus you have? And she's like, no, 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 no. You need actually, you can't imagine grasping. You have to actually do it, and that involves a lot of rigmarole, and then I get lazy and don't do it. But finally, I recruited Jody to collaborate with me. So she's running that experiment now, finding whether those classic visually guided action activations in the parietal lobe for reaching and grasping overlap with the physics network. If it does, I think that will be cool. Not a problem in any way. And actually a really lovely review article from a few years ago by Jason Fisher and Brad Mayon laid out this idea that, that any action you make on the world requires some understanding of the physical structure of the world you're about to act on. And so it could be for very deep reasons that visually guided grasping might overlap with these physics regions, because you have to build a model of the thing you're going to grasp. What is its friction? What is its mass? What is its 3D shape, et cetera? So there's lots more to be done with the overlap of this system and other things people have been studying. How automatic is the operation of these regions? We do find some activation even when there isn't an explicit task. But to what degree these regions are engaged and when, I think is really interesting and wide open. Do they really do actual step-by-step forward simulation, or they just do a one-off prediction? That'll be harder to test. We'll see. How detailed are these simulations? This is a matter of active ongoing debate so far, I think mostly in the behavioral literature, where some think it's extremely sparse, like so rudimentary that you shouldn't even talk about simulation. And there's a whole spectrum of different hybrid models and ways to make shortcuts so that, it seems just ludicrous to model, predict the forward future events of lots of objects in parallel. I don't think anybody does that, but there are ways to choose objects of particular interest, do, simplified simulation. So that's all wide open. Which computational models best capture what these regions are doing? I've been planning to do more systematic testing of the computational models for a long time against functional MRI data and maybe physiology data. It's hard for a whole bunch of reasons, and we're not really there yet, but I think we're getting there. Of course, these regions are connected to lots of other regions in the brain. I like these little dopey models with ovals on top of the brain with different functions. I don't put in the connections because I think our current methods for mapping connections in the human brain are not very good. I know that's controversial, but I don't believe them enough to put them on my diagrams. But they obviously exist, and they're obviously crucial, and it will be really important to discover the connectivity and interactions between this system and the rest of the brain. And of course, it would be really nice to know to what extent these regions are involved, not just in really mundane stuff like picking up objects, but in kind of more elevated, uniquely human operations like inventing novel tools, and perhaps all of science and engineering. And I'll stop there and take questions.
Right, thank you so much, Nancy, for that very clear and stimulating lecture. So, yeah, we will have plenty of time for questions, so the volunteers can pass these two mics around. Let's first take some from the room, and then I will check if people are asking questions online. In the front. Can you give me the microphone, please?
Hi, Nancy. Nice talk. Jörn Diedrichsen, Western University. So you didn't quite answer the question about causal inference and whether the non-physical causal inferences also have their own system, or to what degree they activate a different part of the multi-demand system. I mean, you probably looked at brain-wide contrast in the other direction. So what do you see there?
Do we see anything more for non-causal inference than causal inference?
Okay, but yeah,
is that your question?
In the non-physics situation, in the social,
we get basically right TPJ and some other regions in social causal versus physical causal, which we sort of predicted, and if you think about it, social inferences that involve causes, a lot of them are inferring mental contents, and so it makes sense.
So you think causal inference is a modulator on the specialized systems, basically?
I think it's just the same thing. I think when you ask yourself, why did a person do something, what you're really asking yourself is, what were they thinking, right? And so causal inferences about people largely boil down to theory of mind.
Next question here in the front.
Hi. So my question is, also in the book Mind in Motion, Barbara Tversky talks about how thoughts are also objects that we sort of play around with. And very interestingly, this relates to that. So I was thinking, while we, in terms of learning and education, narratives like we saw, like causal reasoning plays a significant role. So would you see that this would also etch people's memories more, like the physics network? If we say that language is based also on physics, would we see that in education, then sort of building up a spatial intelligence of things would help people?
Great question. I have no idea, but I do, suspect that rich understanding of language, if it's about physical phenomena, will activate those regions, right? I mean, there's all these. This has been noted for, decades, probably centuries. There's all these levels of understanding in language, right? There's everything from, you're reading a textbook and then you realize you've been moving your eyes for many lines, you have no idea what was there. That's the extreme end. Then there's like intermediate thing where you're like, yeah, kind of, sort of, and you're just like, at least my mental introspection is like, I should bother to, understand this more deeply, but I sort of have it, and I'm lazy, and I'm just going to keep reading. All the way through, I need to absolutely get this. I'm going to, sometimes I even take a piece of paper and draw it, or do that in your head. But there's a whole range of degrees of richness of understanding of language. And so my guess is that if it's physical language, part of that is going to involve whether you turn on that other system and build a model up there. And I would certainly think, as in all of the levels of processing literature, the more deeply you process stuff, the better you're going to remember it. But that's just speculation.
Thank you.
Can you maybe pass it to the gentleman here in the front?
Thanks. Really great talk. I was writing up sort of ideas and questions throughout the whole talk on my phone. But one thing that came up is you said that, at least in the models you've tested, the video and image trained ANNs, that they don't seem to have this physics understanding or model. But I was wondering, in the sort of really big and modern, or the most recent video models, for example, where you can prompt them to create a video and they create these really realistic
great
videos.
You asked. Yes, like Sora, you mean?
Yes, exactly. So it seems like they have some sort of like, you can almost like simulate fluid dynamics and stuff like that.
All right, hang on. I didn't get a chance to put this in these, well, I guess I'm not going to go fish through my email in front of 1,000 people. God knows what will pop up. But somewhere, find me later, Tenenbaum has been testing Sora because I've been pestering him. It's like, Josh, I'm talking about this. I don't know all these computational models. What are the latest ones? How do I know? And so that definitely activated his brain. He's been doing all this stuff. So he sent me this hilarious bunch of simulations with Sora, where he took that same kind of roller coaster thing, and he gave it the first frame where the sphere is up here, the second frame where it's here, and asked Sora to predict the trajectory. And it just does ludicrous, absurd things. It flies off at a weird angle and then turns into a completely different object. And, I mean, they're really hilarious. And then he tried to help it more by giving it, that was when he gave it a start point and an end point. And then in a further one, he gave it a start point, an end point, and a middle point. And it kind of takes a crazy path to the middle point and then takes a crazy path to the end point, and it's just completely fails. But anyway, so we haven't tested it more fully, but on the very first test, Sora bombed.
That kind of changes my question then.
Okay.
So I guess then is, say these models, at least for now, don't have a really good, I guess, physics engine. Where do we humans form these representations from then? Is it like a really multimodal, complicated, sort of just bunch of different stuff driving it? Or
I would love to know. I mean, I think the people who know most about that are the developmental psychologists, right, who've shown that, infants a few months old know a lot about the physical world, right? They know that objects can't move through each other, that they continue to exist once occluded, that they don't jump discontinuously through space, et cetera, et cetera. And, within, 3, 4, 5 months, you can show that infants know all of those things. So whatever that core part is, it's there really early. Now, that said, there's a whole learning trajectory, right? So we have some old developmental data on a small number of physics tasks showing that even between, I think, age 4 and 10 or something, there's a lot of development. 4-year-olds were not very good at some of the towers tasks, right? So there's lots of development. And then, of course, there's this whole other question about scope, which I forgot to put on the slide, which is, what about all the things that you learn about in high school, or you learn about if you work in a shop, like levers and springs and pendulums and all that stuff. It's not the kind of things that infants are tested on, and you may or may not have learned the basics of those things before you probably don't know how they work until you work with those things. Does that kind of knowledge use the same system? I have no idea. Anyway, I have no idea how it develops. I think it's deeply interesting. The developmental people would, Liz Felke would say there's a core ability that's innate and that we build upon. I think that's a cool idea, but I don't have evidence for that. Oh, one of the papers I think it's Schultz et al. That just came out a few months ago, was trying to test that question by asking under what circumstances an ANN can learn physics just from videos, right? And their conclusion, I think it was a vision language model, actually. And their conclusion was, not really.
On the top of the list, this question is, what is known about the anatomical connections of regions in the physics network to other cortical regions, and what might this imply for the prerequisite computations that precede physical simulation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I made a kind of side dissing of connectivity in the human brain. I mean, look, we have two methods to look at it in the human brain. We have resting functional correlations, which are clearly related to structural connectivity, but they're not the same thing. You can get high resting functional correlations between brain regions which are known to have no direct structural connections. That's why they make me nervous. Then we have diffusion tractography, which looks at the orientation of water diffusion in the brain as a proxy for the orientation of axons, and you can track those through the brain and make those gorgeous, colored spaghetti pictures of connectivity in the brain. And, I'm trying to use my frontal lobes with jet lag and censor myself. It's not total BS, but I mean, I spent a bunch of years, connectivity matters. I spent a bunch of years trying to use those systems to figure out what the connectivity of these regions is. It drives me crazy not to know how they're connected to each other. But I'm sorry, tractography is not going to answer that. It's fine for finding big fiber bundles, which frankly you can see in regular old anatomical MRIs anyway. But connectivity from one patch of cortex to another, you have to get from gray matter into white matter, which usually involves sharp angle turns. The tractography algorithms assume you don't make sharp angle turns, but you have to get out of gray matter. Then you're on the highway. Then you have to get from this fiber that's on the highway with all the other fibers, figure out which one is leaving that highway to go to this other region. There's no way in hell you can distinguish that. So unfortunately, I don't think we know what's connected to what in the cortex in humans, despite the thousands of papers written about it. I would desperately like to know, but I think we don't know. So yes, the connections exist. I'm sure those regions are connected to all kinds of other regions, but I don't think we know, and we need to know, and I hope somebody will invent a better method.
All right. Would you expect models such as GNNs, which I think are graph neural networks, that are directly fed the abstract information, such as velocity, instead of images, perform better at predicting physics network responses?
Yes. I think a lot of the problem with the physics models is the perceptual front end, right? Even image segmentation, contact, occlusion, these things are famously hard. And so if you bypass all that and cheat by giving that information into a physics engine, of course it can take it from there, right?
Okay, any more questions from the room? Burning questions?
In the back.
Oh, all the way in the back. Screen is flashing.
Hello. Sorry, I have a very burning question about, so you have been testing models in which, for example, gravity and mass are consistent with what we experience in reality. What about, for example, testing other moments in which like the physics is consistent, but the constants, for example, are different? For example, if I go to another planet, I can change gravity, but still I can maybe predict the movements.
Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't tested that. My guess is that, I think we're pretty flexible, right? Like you can appreciate, a video game or a, sci-fi movie where weird physical stuff happens. At first you're surprised and then you just roll with it, right? So I suspect there's parameters that you can pretty quickly adapt on the fly. So my guess is if we did that, there would be like an initial big, expectation violation response, and then it would probably just follow along, but I don't know. I will say there's a really nice study by Sherry Liu looking at it's not exactly your question, but it's relevant to, she tests physical violations. And she finds higher responses in approximately these regions for physical violations compared to physical non-violations, but not for unexpected social events compared to expected social events, consistent with the idea that there are some priors about how things should behave physically.
Maybe the nice question that connects to that I see here again on the online is all of these tasks, such as collision versus not, or more blocks falling to the left or the right versus their color, they have a prediction component versus just recognition. So what makes us sure that this is about physics?
Well, I would say prediction is really key to physics, but I guess maybe the question is, are those regions involved in generic prediction even for non-physical things? That would be a different hypothesis that I'm putting forth. But I think our various controls, well, we have a few of them at least, the various social controls at least, involve prediction, but not physical prediction. But yeah, I mean, as many people have been commenting for a long time, prediction is of the essence in cognition and probably many different facets of cognition, and I'm sure it's of the essence in the physics system as well. But I don't think that system is doing generic prediction for non-physical stuff to anything like the same degree.
Right, any further questions from the room? There.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So it seems to me that the rules of physics are somewhat the rules of the game. Whatever model of the world, this is the world we live in, this is basically the game we're playing, and the physics are the rules of this game. So do you think that something similar would apply to other games, like more abstract situations? For instance, you have maybe like there are certain moves that you can do within this abstract space. Do you think those rules would be somewhat similar to these rules of intuitive physics? And like,
can you give me an example? I mean, do you mean like logical problems, or like what other? You mean like chess, or well, I don't know.
Yeah, for instance, like chess has certain rules, or like other board games. So you might be able to do certain types of actions, and some actions might not be possible, and that is not. That does not correspond to real life, but it's the same type of restriction that we face in the physical world.
I think that's very interesting, and I don't immediately know. I mean, I have to predict. The physics engine hypothesis says it should not be engaged when you're reasoning about the rules of chess. But I haven't tested that, and it's an interesting question.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll just ask a final question that I had when you showed the GPT-5 example. So what happened if you don't change the title of the file to miss? Will it then make the right prediction?
I think that Georgina tested that as well. But I skipped through it because I didn't want to waste all the time with its many musings. But the first thing it said is, well, I can't believe just the title. It says miss, but maybe you're trying to fool me, right? So it's on to that. I thought that was pretty good. I think it wasn't affected by the title.
Great. All right. Well, that's our full hour. So let's thank Professor Kanwisher again.